Well, Hannah, you want to go ahead and start? I'll say thank you all for joining us today for our day on the Hill. We have Hannah Cox here this morning, and she is the national director. Tell me your title again.
Senior National Manager.
Senior National Manager for Conservatives Concerned about the Death Penalty. And she has been educating and mobilizing conservatives around the flaws of the death penalty. Her work has left to has led to repeal of the death penalty in two states, while dozens of other Republican lawmakers have sponsored repeal bills across the country. Hannah graduated from Belmont University and previously worked as the director of outreach for the Beacon Center of Tennessee, as a policy analyst for the National Alliance on Mental Illness, and as the director of development for the Tennessee Firearms Association. She's also a Newsmax insider. And Hannah, I'll let you tell a little bit about your work, what you've been doing these last few years around the death penalty. And then if anyone has any questions, you can send them to me on the chat and we'll ask her at the end of her presentation.
Great. Well, good to be back with you guys virtually in my old stomping grounds. Amy, thanks for the introduction. And Stacy, thanks for having me. I did come up in my career in Nashville. I graduated from Belmont University with a music business degree, as one might anticipate, and worked in the music industry for 5 years after college. So I was in for a total of 8. And I just really found that I was unhappy in that work and had determined I was going to try to forge another career path. I wasn't really sure what I wanted that to be. And I was looking into either the law or psychology. And throughout that process of looking kind of for something I could do on the side and try my hand at and see if I liked it, I stumbled into politics and I started working for the Tennessee Firearms Association. And I just thought, I like the Second Amendment and I like politics. Like, why not? and started working in that capacity and was doing a lot of grassroots organizing and working on the state legislature. And I just really fell in love with working on policy and with also taking policy back to the people and helping people understand what was going on at their state legislatures. And it was a really good experience for me, but it was also this real time of upheaval politically in my life because I was encountering a lot of things that I hadn't grown up with. I grew up very traditionally conservative and Republican. And I think I was just, very moderate in my Republican views. And what I was encountering was a lot of populism and a lot of just branches of conservatism that didn't really align with how I'd grown up. And so it really forced me to go and do some digging into what I actually believed, why I believed it, what my principles were, and get a more solid foundation moving forward. During that time, I also started doing some work with the National Alliance on Mental Illness as a policy advocate. And I was always very passionate about mental health issues and just felt really compelled that as somebody who did believe in a limited government and free market solutions, that we needed to show up in these issues and try to find those kinds of proposals versus just always saying no to the things that the left would come up with, which were always more government, bigger government. And it was through the course of that work that I first encountered the death penalty. And there was a bill that was going to be coming up in Tennessee that was going to be working to exclude people with severe mental illness from the death penalty. And NAMI asked me to work on it on their behalf. And I said, oh, no, I can't do that one for you. I'm not with you on that. And they were like, oh, you're like the big limited government person. You think government should get to kill people? It's just this framing shift of the death penalty that I'd never encountered. Everybody I knew supported it. No one I knew had ever been near the justice system or had any clue what they were talking about. And it was just sort of this knee-jerk emotional reaction. And I thought, all Republicans supported the death penalty and couldn't imagine like coming out against it, and they kept questioning me in this really like very friendly way, but very firm way of like, have you looked into this? Do you know about the innocence issues? And the reality was I had never done my due diligence. I knew nothing about what I was talking about. And I hate to ever be caught with egg on my face in that kind of situation. So I went to the books and I started researching as much as I could. And I started finding all these problems and I was really aghast at what was happening in our system. But I also was sort of ashamed because as I dug further and further into it, I thought, I knew this about government. This is why I believe in a limited government. I know it's prone to error and to fallibility and to corruption. Like, why would I ever think the Justice Department was somehow different than the post office? Like, of course it operates in this way. And so as I was changing my views on this, I remember I went to a meeting for a coalition that was forming that Stacey Rector was leading, and Amy was there. And I remember she introduced herself and she said that she was the Tennessee coordinator for conservatives concerned about the death penalty. And I thought, there's a whole organization of Republicans against the death penalty. Like, oh my gosh, I guess this is okay. Like, I guess there's a lot of us. And that was just a real like shifting point for me. So I went on to actually lead that coalition's efforts for a number of years with Stacy and Amy, and began working a bit more intensely on the death penalty, and at that same time transitioned into working full time for the Beacon Center of Tennessee. And so I've kind of had, gosh, 6-7 years worth of working on these issues now. And 3 years ago, almost, I took over the senior national role with Conservatives Concerned About the Death Penalty and have been working in that capacity ever since. So just to give you some background on the organization, it actually formed really organically in Montana around 2007, 2008, I believe. And a lot of people always say, like, your name is a mouthful, and it is. Conservatives Concerned About the Death Penalty. Like, even our acronym is like 7 letters long. It's so long. But the reason for that is because this wasn't there wasn't like this, power group in a room coming up with this entity. It was a group of like grassroots young conservatives who just genuinely were concerned about things they saw happening around their legislature. Their legislature was considering a bill at the time that would have shortened their appellate process, as we often see proposed in state legislatures. And they were really upset about that. They didn't think it was something that Republicans or conservatives should support. And so they kind of loosely started calling themselves Conservatives Concerned About the Death Penalty, and talking to other Republicans and tabling at different Republican events. And what they found was that there were a lot of Republicans that actually responded to that and started coming out of the woodwork. And they're like, oh, I've been struggling with this too. It never really made sense to me, or I have these questions. I just didn't know where to go, where I felt like I could get like solid conservative upfront answers on this. And so it really took off. Other states started wanting to have a presence. And in 2013, it actually went national as a project of Equal Justice USA at CPAC is where we launched. And we've been growing steadily ever since then. We now have 15 state chapters across the country. We've actually been involved with 3 repeal campaigns. We haven't updated the website because the last one just happened very recently. But since my time here, we have seen New Hampshire repeal and actually override a governor's veto. We have seen Colorado repeal, and now we've seen Virginia repeal. And we have several other states that are sort of coming up in the wings. There's a lot of movement happening in Ohio. There has been tremendous organizing work done in Wyoming. And then there's a lot of secondary efforts that are happening in a number of other states that might not repeal in the next year or two, but that are really building the foundation to ultimately launch campaigns that could succeed in the next 5 years or so, I think. And so there's just really exciting momentum. We've had 10 or 11 states with close to 60 Republican lawmakers over the past couple of years who have actually sponsored bills to repeal the death penalty. So they're not just voting in favor of it, they're actually often leading the charge on this. And in each of the 3 states that we've seen where we have had success in the past couple of years, in each of those states, we would not have been able to achieve that merely with Democrat support. It's always come down to the Republicans, especially in New Hampshire, when they actually overrode their own governor's veto, which is a really big deal. So I think that we've really seen a lot of movement at the grassroots level. It's been happening sort of quietly. It's been happening in the states. It's often not covered by the national media. It's often very disconnected to what's happening in DC. But there's been real movement, and I think if you look at polling, it's reflecting that. Of course, polling has drastically decreased in the number of people who say that they favor the death penalty or who say that they believe it's applied fairly over the past 2 decades. But really, if you look at what's happening in practice, the numbers are even more stark. I think it's very easy to self-select and take a knee-jerk poll. But when we look at what people are doing around the system when they're actually asked to participate, they are turning away from it in droves. We see that juries have declined to give death sentences more often than not. Since 2000, we've seen new death sentences plummet 60% as they've been presented with alternate sentences like life in prison without parole. They tend to pick those sentences versus things like the death penalty. We also see the number of states carrying out executions has really, really decreased. We have 23 states that have repealed legislatively. We have 3 other states that have moratoriums. So we have less than half the country that even still has the death penalty active in their states. But of those that do have it active, over a third of them have not carried out an execution in a decade or more. We've seen the entire nation hold executions well under 30 per year for the past 6 years. And so this is really something that's dwindling and coming down to a number of like 7 or 8 states that are still actively doing this. And it's really heavily concentrated in the Deep South where this continues to be a practice. I think there's a lot of reasons for that. I think the first one is really practicality. The vast majority of people have recognized that this is a system that does not provide a deterrent effect. It's the most expensive part of our justice system on a per offender basis. And so when you consider those two facts together, that means the death penalty is an opportunity cost that wastes a tremendous amount of money that does not actually make our community safer. And it does that at the expense of victims, of their family members, and while risking innocent life. And so we see that the vast majority of district attorneys, even in states like Tennessee, choose to not pursue the death penalty. We know that only 2% of counties in this country bring the majority of death penalty sentences. Since the reinstatement of executions in the late 70s, every execution we've had across states and federally has come from less than 16% of our nation's counties. And so what that shows you is that the vast majority of district attorneys who have almost unilateral decision-making power in whether or not to pursue these sentences have recognized that this is something that clogs the system. It wastes money. It makes us less safe, and it is simply not worth it. And they have become much more effective at dealing with the actual cases in their communities. What you tend to have are a couple district attorneys in each state, usually in very large areas with more resources, typically trying to climb the political ladder, who do consistently pursue death penalty cases over and over and over. And that's where most of them come from. As mentioned, even when they do pursue them, the vast majority of juries are saying no at the end of the trial. Now, that's important to recognize because, contrary to popular belief, the vast majority of the expense of the death penalty does not come from the appellate process. It does not come from the execution method. It comes from the trial alone. 70% of those costs come from the trial. And that's because the trial is more comprehensive. It is longer. It takes more resources. It takes more people, usually all on the public dimes, working within the system to move these cases forward. So even if the jury says no, which again, they mostly are, the taxpayers have still incurred about $1 million in excess each time that a district attorney pursues the death penalty. That's a lot of money and wasted resources. And so you really can see which district attorneys are being better stewards of our dollars and which ones are not. Aside from that, I think that public sentiment has really moved on the death penalty, especially in the past decade. And I think there's a lot of factors that determine that. But I often say that the reason we consistently win on this issue and will continue to win is because all of the data is on our side. I didn't change my mind on it because I went out and wanted to, or because I had, emotional kind of change on it. I changed my mind because I was presented with an overwhelming body of data and evidence that said this was stupid and that we shouldn't be doing that and that hurt people. And so I think that when we can get that information in front of others, we typically find that most people will move away from it pretty quickly because it really is just so overwhelming. And I think in the age of information, we've been presented with this opportunity to get that data in front of people who otherwise would not have encountered it. I was somebody who, for various reasons, was probably never going to encounter the criminal justice system in a meaningful way. I live in the suburbs, I'm middle class, I'm white, I have all these, sort of privilege factors that mean that I'm not going to come up close in person with the justice system in a way that many communities do. And so I was largely unaware of the way things operated within the justice system. Had it not been for my work with NAMI, I don't know that I ever really would have been presented with the information, the data that I was. And I think for the average American, they're in that same boat. But the age of information, the internet, and also the prevalence of the true crime entertainment genre that has just really taken off in podcast form and documentary form and streaming form over the past, couple of years has really allowed people to see behind the curtain of the justice system in a way that they never did before and see it up close and personal, and also have these like stories and names and faces attached to it. So it's not just statistics on a page to them anymore. And I think that that has done a lot to really move people on criminal justice reform writ large and on the death penalty specifically. So there's some really encouraging things happening. I want to talk a little bit about how to talk to conservatives about this issue, because I think that's something that many people are fearful of or struggle with. And I first and foremost just want to emphasize, I think when I first started this work, I was so nervous. I remember like even posting that I'd taken this job and I thought, oh my gosh, my Facebook followers are going to just lambaste me. And it really never happened. What I found was that there really was a lot more curiosity. I think there's still sort of a shock factor when people find out that conservatives are against the death penalty and they really just want to know why. If they are conservatives themselves, there's sort of the reaction that I had to Amy the first time I met her of like, there's a whole group of conservatives that think differently than me on this. Like, what am I missing? Did the party move? Like, am I out of the loop? Just very much wanting to figure out what's transpired. And I think this can kind of be used to our advantage. I don't like this fact in our society, but we have sort of a team mentality within the Democrat and Republican parties where people sort of put themselves in one camp or the other. And a lot of them never did what I did back in the day, which was really, seek to figure out their principles and their ideology and why they believe what they believe. They instead just sort of follow the party, follow other leaders within the party, follow other people. And so if it looks like a large group of conservatives are moving somewhere on one issue, they're like, wait, am I supposed to be moving on this too? And they will. We saw them move really quickly on a number of issues under Trump. So I think that there is a way to really highlight the number of Republicans who have already moved on this. This isn't new. This has been going on for 2 decades. You just haven't heard about it because, again, it's been at the state level and not the national level. And so the media doesn't pick up on it most of the time. We've had a number of very high profile Republicans and conservatives who have signed our statement of support alone. And they really range, and they're all shapes and kinds of Republicans. We have everybody from Oliver North to Michelle Malkin, like very different kinds of Republicans who have come out against this. And I think that once people start to recognize that, it can give them the permission to let their guard down and start to really listen to the facts and the data surrounding it. As far as actually talking about the issue, though, I often tell people on the left, I'm like, the issues that will get conservatives on this are the same that will move most people on the left. They're not different. It's just really more in how you frame them, I think, and in how you have those conversations. One, I think relationships are really important because when you're asking somebody to change their mind on something, that's a hard thing for people to do. It's not something that the average person does very often, at least not cognitively. And it's something that when it's an emotional issue like the death penalty, one that's kind of more wrapped up in people's ethics more often than not, or their religion, it can be even harder for them to do. And so I think having a relationship with you, being able to trust you, knowing your character, knowing you're somebody who approaches issues honestly, I think that's a really important component. I'm in a position where I come in and I speak as the head of an organization, and I think that brings some trust with it and some better ability to get people's attention. But I really think where most people change their mind is in conversation with people that they know. And so I think that there is so much important work that can be done. I often have people reach out and say, like, what can I do to help? And it's more so just talking to people you know than anything else. You can post information on your social media. You can speak at your local Rotary Club or Republicans Women's Group or whatever you're involved with, and just get this information in front of them. It's a lot more about the messenger than I think it is the message oftentimes. And I often think it's really more important to address this from a sense of practical reason versus emotional or ethos reasons. And Amy knows this, but I often said for years, I think, while I was even leading TASME for a number of years, I would say, I'm against the death penalty in theory, but like, I don't feel anything. Like I would work around other people in the death penalty movement that would get very emotional about it or have, strong reactions. And I just didn't feel that. I didn't have any sort of like internal change on it. I just was like, on paper, this is stupid. We shouldn't be doing this anymore. And it actually really took me getting to know and hear in person the stories of people like Ray Crone, who have been exonerated, meeting some of the murder victims' family members, for me to finally like have that progression internally where I was like, oh, okay, no, I actually think this is wrong, period. But that took years for me to get there. And it doesn't really matter if people get there. I think too often we try to come at people and say, this is ethically wrong, we shouldn't kill people, or, this is morally wrong. And that's the wrong way to approach it. It just is. It's something that's a very personal matter for people. And I don't think that's where we need to get people. I think we need people to understand that it is broken in practice, that it operates in a manner that wastes our resources, that makes us less safe, that perpetrates more harm on more people, that waste resources that could be going to services victims' family members actually need and want, towards community programs that would deter violence, towards solving more crimes, which I must remind people, the vast majority of victims' families get nothing. They get no closure or justice whatsoever because we're not even solving their cases. The clearance rates in this country are abysmal. We have an average 60% homicide clearance rate in this country. If you dig into the data, many localities are far less than that. And so it really is something that I think you can look at from a very sensible standpoint and just say, this doesn't work. This wastes money. This risks innocent life. It's arbitrary. There's racial bias in it. And you can kind of run through all the broken factors with it, because there are an overwhelming number of problems with it. I'm often asked, what's the number one reason conservatives are changing on this issue or moving on this issue? And I'm like, there's not one issue. There's like 15 issues, and I can't tell you which one resonates with people more than the other. I think that changes person to person. Certainly the innocence issues get people's attention, but I think it's more so the bulk of all of the problems taken together is so overwhelming. There's no way we could possibly fix the system. There's no reason a reasonable person would ever think, looking at the bulk of these problems, that we could come in and adjust it, because these problems are inherent to government. They aren't specific to just the death penalty. They're worse within the death penalty because we're dealing with matters of life and death. But we see these same kinds of issues and breakdowns throughout various parts of the system. So ultimately, I think that we just need to get that same body of information about people. And Amy, I'm happy to dig more into like all of the problems with death penalty, but I also don't want to like talk down to our audience, because I know a lot of people here are probably well versed.
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. Thanks, Hannah. Yeah, I will open it up for questions now. So send me any in the chat, but I'm also going to do a lightning round while I wait for y'all's questions to come in with Hannah. Hannah, I will say, I think I get that response a lot. Like, well, for every death penalty case, these abolitionists or these people against the death penalty are always coming up with excuses. And I think you're so right that it's because there are so many problems, and it's not just one thing that, if we could fix it, then everything would be fine. It's that it's mounds of issues with the death penalty. All right, let me do the lightning round. I have these. Let me pull up the questions real quick. But everyone, please send me questions that you're curious about in the meantime. All right, so these are kind of typical questions I've gotten throughout my work. So some of them may seem a little blunt, but like I said, I get these a lot too. So if you kill someone, don't you deserve to die?
Yeah, I get that one a lot too. And I think again, it's the wrong question. And I think it's okay to tell people that. I often tell them, I could sit here and grapple all day with you about theoretically whether or not a person deserves to die for something that they've done. I've reached a point in my religious and ethical views where I no longer think that that is the case. I think people can be redeemed. I am a Christian because I know for a fact people can be redeemed and can find restoration. And I don't think that that means there shouldn't be accountability. I absolutely think that that's an essential component. Anytime we're talking about justice, you have to have accountability and repercussions for things. But I think when we say that somebody can be eliminated because they've done something awful, all of us have done something awful. All of us have. According to my religion, everybody has sinned and fallen short of the grace of God. So we would all get the same fate. We would all get the death penalty ultimately, were it not for God's gift of salvation. Now, that's my personal religious views. I can't force those on people. Not everyone I speak to is a Christian and holds those views. But to Christians, I think that is especially poignant and something they need to remember in their own experience. There are many examples of murderers in the Bible who were redeemed. Paul wrote half the words that these people continue to live by and was a murderer, and they yet don't sort of see the breakdown in their views when they think that somebody should lose their life because they've done something harmful. I think that that actually is something that pours into a culture that is not pro-life at all. It's something that says that human life is disposable. And those kinds of views matter. I think when we say that human life is disposable in these other areas, it makes it much easier for people to think that human life is disposable at the beginning of life, at conception. It creates a culture that is entirely not consistent on that ethos. So I think there's problems with that. But ultimately, we don't have to land at the same place on that, whether or not a person deserves to die. Usually I get Ted Bundy on that. It's almost always Ted Bundy. It's almost always an outlier in the system where you're like, that is like 0.0000001% of cases that you will ever see in the system. And yet it's the one you know about because it's such an outlier that it's become infamous. And yet you want to make a whole system for 330 million people based on that one case. Sure, there are people like Ted Bundy where, we could grapple with that, and it might be harder to conclusively say than others. But ultimately, it's not worth the risk that we incur. It's not worth the money that we spend trying to give you a sense of justice to get Ted Bundy. That just doesn't actually make sense. That's not how we set public policy. We need to set public policy based on what works, based on what is the best use of our resources, most effective use of our tax dollars, what makes communities safer, what actually provides healing, what deters violence in the first place. The death
Yeah.
penalty doesn't do any of those.
Yeah, and I also remind people that the vast majority of murderers don't even get the death penalty.
Right.
So then you start looking at, well, why does someone get the death penalty? And so another question, is it usually the worst of the worst that get the death penalty?
Yeah, that is I would say the most prevalent false assumption that's out there around the death penalty, and it's one that I used to hold to. And it's another one where you're like, huh, what is the worst of the worst? Let's just start there. That's pretty subjective, right? I'm pretty sure to every family who loses a loved one, that's the worst of the worst. Like there's this need to rank victims, which we do in our system. We do it every day by deciding which victims get resources, which victims we're going to spend an excess million pursuing death penalty cases for. We basically try to rank life, and I think that's really foul and disgusting. I think all life has equal value. Um, and I think ultimately we cannot say what the worst of the worst is. It's completely subjective. But let's say we somehow were able to land on something like I think people who kill kids is something I usually hear from people out in society. That has nothing to do with how we determine who gets the death penalty. Absolutely nothing. In fact, I would say you see very few child murderers on death row. That's not really a common case that I encounter. As a whole, we again see it come down to the location where the crime was committed because of the district attorney's unilateral power in determining who gets this. You really can dig into state death row populations and find people who committed a crime and got the death penalty for it, and probably find somebody on life in prison without parole sentence, or even who didn't get life at all, who committed almost an identical crime, and yet they got these various vastly different uh, um, sentences because of the district attorney's decision making. The following factors after the location of the crime that determine it are the socioeconomic status of the defendant. We very rarely see somebody of any means who ends up on death row. This is almost entirely poor people who get this. And then we see the race of the victim play a really, really big factor in who gets the death penalty. The vast majority of people who go to death row are there for cases with white victims. Across the country in studies, we've seen that 96% of the time the cases had racial bias involved. And the number one combination across our nation for death row sentences is a Black defendant with a white victim. Now, consider the fact that most victims are killed by someone of the same race. So the leading homicides in this country are white on white crime, Black on Black crime, et cetera. And yet you see the vast majority of death sentences are Black defendants with white victims. And so you really can see very stark racial bias. We intend to think across the country, whether it's subjectively or cognitively, that when a Black person kills a white person, this is the worst of the worst. And that's who gets the death penalty.
Thanks. So here's a question from one of the attendees. She said, you mentioned that there are 2% of counties making up the death penalty cases. If known, what are the counties that make up that 2%? And I think she's asking about Tennessee specifically. So let me say that in Tennessee, 50% of our cases actually come from Shelby County alone. The vast majority of counties don't have anyone on death row, have never executed anyone. So it is very centered here in Tennessee around Shelby County. But you can answer more on the national level.
Yeah, I don't know the counties off the top of my head. The Death Penalty Information Center has a great resource if you really want to dig into that data. I think their website is dpic.org, and you can go in and look. But it tends to be the bigger counties in each state. It tends to be the counties that have more money because most counties can't afford to pursue death penalty cases. It's again very, very expensive, and it tends to be places that have higher populations of people of color.
All right, here's another question. What resources do you recommend for going deeper into the data and issues with the death penalty?
Again, dpic.org is sort of like the death penalty Bible. They are a nonpartisan think tank. They actually don't even take a stance on the death penalty. They just straight report around it. And they have a tremendous body of work on their website on every subject discussed here today and more. If you really want to get granular with it, if you really want to get interactive with it, they just have a fantastic resource with their website. So I definitely recommend them. There's tons of studies that they've also collected there. They don't always produce the studies, but they itemize them and give really excellent pointers to find more of them.
All right, here's another one. What's the best response when someone responds to your opposition to the death penalty by trying to turn the discussion toward abortion?
Well, I just say, I have a consistent view on abortion. Do you have a consistent view on life issues like this? I think it's very funny to me that oftentimes that kind of knee-jerk reaction comes about when people assume they're talking with somebody on the left, which is often something that I see happen in many discussions and many interactions where if you say anything that's outside the party line, people are like, oh, well, then you're a Democrat, and they try to write you off in that way. It doesn't work when you're not. So at the end of the day, I think as a conservative, that's a pretty easy argument to address. And I think, if you're a Democrat, having that turned back on you, from my opinion, you need to examine your life ethos as well. So
So how would you frame your talking points on the bills we are seeing that are specifically focused on intellectual disabilities?
yeah, I think that's a great issue to elevate actually, because it's been illegal since the early 2000s to kill people with intellectual disabilities, and yet we still do it. It's a really good case and point for people who continue to think somehow that we're going to come in and fix all these issues with the death penalty. It's like even when we do fix or address an issue with the death penalty, it doesn't get fixed. Ultimately, there's still all these loopholes and problems and ways that the system works around itself. When that was established by the Supreme Court, it basically left the door open for states to come in and set their own statutes and make determinations of how they would determine whether or not somebody had an intellectual disability. In most of the states that did erect those statutes, they just went with like a simple IQ, which doesn't really fully encapsulate people with intellectual disabilities. And even in many other states like Texas, they just didn't do it and continued to sentence people. And even up until last year, were struggling to set their statutes. So as a whole, I think it's a very good example to show people like at this point in our society, I think there's very few people who would say we should kill people with intellectual disabilities. And yet this continues to happen. It's similar to mental illness in the sense that most people are under the impression we already stopped doing this. And most people would agree that like we shouldn't kill people who are psychotic, schizophrenic, who have these very serious mental illnesses and are surprised to find the prevalence of those people on our death rows. And so it's a really good way to elevate pieces of data that I don't think the average American is familiar with and just point to how broken government is. This is why it needs to be so limited. It cannot fix itself. It will never run perfectly. It will always have problems. And so it needs to be very limited in its scope and in its power. It needs to have a lot of accountability and transparency when we do authorize its use. And we are nowhere close to that.
So another question is, what is a sign that the conversation needs to stop with someone who is staunch in their position? And I'll also add to that, oftentimes I think we're kind of in this age where people have their own facts. And so how do you address like when someone's facts are just blatantly wrong, and they're not taking the truth for an answer?
Yeah, I think it's actually pretty easy to tell when you're dealing with a person of reason and when you're not. And I deal with this with lawmakers too, where like you have reasonable, open-minded people who are interested in discussion, and then you have people who are very closed-minded and typically aren't as educated and typically aren't as capable of becoming educated. And I think that there is a posture. Everybody has to have their own boundaries. Let me say that first and foremost. I don't think you should ever put yourself in a situation where you're being disrespected or where you feel like you're being abused in this discussion. For me, I will debate heavily with somebody and go 9 rounds with them as long as it stays respectful and as long as it's not becoming derogatory towards me. If that person cannot conduct themselves in that way, then I shut down the conversation. So I think it just determines, it's different for everybody. And I think there's often a frustration when people don't change their minds right away. But I think you should go into those discussions expecting people to not change their mind unilaterally at the end of the conversation and instead focus on getting them to basically admit like it's wrong that we kill people with mental illness. It's wrong that there's racial bias in the system. Let them sit with those things, let them marinate on it. And I think they will continue to move down that path. But again, it takes a lot of time, and it honestly takes a good bit of humility for people to ultimately change their mind on things like this, especially again, if they have pastors who are telling them this is needed or right, or if they have other leadership that they look up to, or if they're a public official who feels like they are going to have to answer to their constituents over it.
Very good. So y'all keep sending questions. We have about 20 more minutes. I have one question here that says, you may have addressed this, but how do you convey to someone that executing even one innocent person is too many if they're later exonerated, which has happened more than once?
Yeah, if somebody doesn't think that executing an innocent person is one people too many, I'm concerned for them. I think as a whole, like you really, again, you cannot claim to be pro-life if you don't care about that. Ultimately, I think that we should always be concerned when innocent people are harmed, and we certainly know that far more than one innocent person has been executed. I would say for the past 3 years, even though again the country has held executions to 30 or under, there's been at least one execution every year, usually several, where I feel very strongly there's evidence that person is innocent. I think at the end of the day, we really need to do a better job of helping people understand not only how many innocent people there are, but the reasons that there are so many innocent people, because in understanding that they will know this isn't like a slip up. This is something that will continue to happen in droves because of how our system functions. It's not an accident. It's not a minor occurrence. This is frequent and will always be frequent because there are so many problems in our system that continue to produce that. You know, we have no accountability for prosecutors or law enforcement who lie, which they frequently do. They have qualified immunity and they basically get away with it with maybe a slap on the wrist at best. And so there's really nothing in the system incentivizing against that. There will always be those kinds of problems. And within that, you see, you know, withholding of evidence, you see evidence tampering, you see problems with DNA evidence. You know, the wrongful convictions we've discovered thus far, 45% of them involved the misapplication of forensic science. They involved technicians lying under oath, contaminating in the lab. We saw them basically taking partial DNA portfolios and saying they were more conclusive than they were, on and on and on. This is something that will keep happening. And so I really do think you have to point to the underlying issues with innocence. But again, I really question anybody who claims to be a person who believes in individual liberty, who claims to be for limited government, being okay with even one person being executed innocently. You know, I think that that's somebody who actually seems to have a very collectivist mindset. I love the quote that says the smallest minority on earth is the individual. Our laws, our country, our foundations were set up to protect and enshrine individual rights. And if one person is violated by the government, that is every bit as bad as 1,000 people being violated by the government.
Yeah. So along those lines, I always get well, people who are exonerated aren't truly innocent, or, well, that used to happen in the past. It doesn't happen anymore with all the science that we have, or, kind of those arguments or around those lines. How do you address those?
Yeah, it's again amazing to me the bold assumptions and statements people will make while clearly broadcasting they've never been near the system, because either of those claims is just so blatantly false. It's kind of laughable, but then again, I just have to always remember like I used to be one of those people. So show a little grace. But as far as the exonerations, I just think that's so absurd. Like ultimately, we've had far more than one person who's been innocent for every 8 executions. It's one person exonerated for every 8. But we have hundreds of others who have been released from death row who were innocent, but we're not able to be fully exonerated because it is a much higher burden and barrier to receive that classification in the system. Number one, it is really hard to work a wrongful conviction out of the system. Everything within the system works to uphold itself, to protect itself. Again, the reason poor people usually get these sentences and can't appeal them, get out of them, is there's all these really minute details and like loopholes and deadlines that if you don't have a very good attorney to like catch all these things, you'll never be able to get your way through. And in fact, the vast majority of people we've seen who have been exonerated or released over innocence issues have not received that because the system worked and caught its own error. They typically are people who are fortunate enough to get outside pro bono legal help from groups like the Innocence Project that come in and comb through these cases and know how to meet those loopholes and like maneuver through all of these kind of potholes the government has set to basically prevent people from being able to prove their innocence. We frequently see them block to test DNA evidence that could exonerate people. We see them block new hearings, new evidence, new testimony that could exonerate people. In Tennessee, they likely executed an innocent guy in 2006, and they're still blocking evidence testing that would prove it because they don't want to have to pay out to the families. And so, as a whole, for somebody to even basically be able to get an Alford plea or to have their trial overturned or reversed or be released in any capacity is, I mean, you hit the jackpot in the lottery of the justice system. It's very, very difficult. And then to meet the additional burden of getting exonerated, where typically in those instances, they're having to show that someone else was convicted for the crime, conclusively prove that DNA matched to somebody else, et cetera. Those people are innocent. That's just totally stupid. I just can't fathom how somebody could possibly think you could jump through all of these loopholes and like not actually be innocent. As a whole, we really do see that these people continue to face that kind of public scrutiny, though, and oftentimes they don't get the big settlements everybody thinks. That's also very difficult to get. Many of them do not, and we see that they continue to have trouble getting jobs. We see society continues to blacklist them and basically treat them as though they're guilty, even when they've been exonerated. And so it's a huge, huge problem in our society where these people have been vastly wronged by the system and then continue to face repercussions for it, even when they come out. When people think that we no longer will have these issues with innocence, now that we're in this new age, I think they watch too much sci-fi because we are not in this new age. And I used to sort of have this impression, and it's not just around DNA evidence, it's around a lot of things where people think our society is much more advanced than it is. And it should be for the amount of money we pay in taxes. But honestly, our system is kind of a joke and it's not very competent or capable. And again, we can barely solve crimes, even clear crimes, much less, have all this data and information around it. Ultimately, when you look into the causes of wrongful convictions, again, DNA itself plays a major role in wrongfully convicting people. That's for the lab reasons and ethical reasons of lying and misrepresentation of facts I mentioned earlier. But it's also because our science isn't that advanced. 10 years ago, we were using things like bite mark evidence to put people on death row. That's totally junk science. It's not at all like conclusive. It's no longer allowed. Now, they haven't gone back in and really examined the cases where people were convicted and sentenced off that kind of junk science. But we used it for a number of years. We used things like microscopic hair analysis, ballistic missile testing, all of these things that were just totally junk. Yet we brought it into courtrooms and said that it was conclusive science and told juries that, and people were convicted and people were killed over it. And so I think it's actually quite ridiculous to rely on DNA and things like this to save us from wrongful convictions. Ultimately, we still only have DNA evidence in about 10% or less of cases. And again, when we do have it, it's often used to convict people wrongfully. It's a tool. It's a tool that can be used to exonerate people too, but it's something that should be taken with a whole body of evidence. And unfortunately, due to shows like CSI and Law and Order, many juries are far too prone to trust it conclusively and to believe that the presence of it is something that can conclusively prove someone is guilty. It's not. And we also continue to see, just based off the data, that we have many people who were convicted well into the 2000s who have since been exonerated. So there's nothing whatsoever about either of those statements that holds up. And anybody who spent, 15, 20 minutes looking into the justice system would quickly realize that.
Yeah. So you mentioned pastors. Have you ever had an experience of talking to a pastor and helping them change their mind on the death penalty? And I know your dad's a pastor.
I was going to say, have I? My dad is actually a Southern Baptist minister. So I grew up like this. I grew up being told that the death penalty was biblical and justified and needed. And yeah, my dad and I go round and round on it. I don't know exactly where he stands right now, but I certainly know both he and my mother have had their eyes open to so many issues with the system, and also have seen. I have two cousins that have started to have issues of their own with the system, and so I think through seeing those interactions of family members, it's starting to hit them differently. They'll complain to me about prosecutorial misconduct, and I'm like, yeah, I've been telling you about this for years, but now that it's happening to somebody now it feels like a bigger deal. That's unfortunately like just part of humanity, where I think it's hard for people always to feel empathy or really care about some of these facts you tell them until they know somebody it happens to. And I don't wish the justice system and its corruption on anybody, but I do wish everybody could see it up close. It really is prevalent. It really is bad. For a lot of pastors, I think this is true for a number of issues, actually. And as a pastor's kid, I've had a front seat view to it. Pastors are in a more political position than people realize. And I don't mean that as in they're part of our political system, but I mean that in the sense that they are in positions that can be politicized. And they often are also accountable and have to answer to their congregations. They are in positions where they are working with a lot of like political factors behind the scenes as far as leadership goes and whose authorities fall in the church, and which church members are causing problems. Like there's all kinds of things that go on in churches that I don't know that people who are just everyday members always see or know about. But I think pastors are in really difficult positions. And I also think, just as you wouldn't expect a politician to come out on their own and change their mind on this without support from people around them, I also don't know that we can always ask that of pastors. I think they also need support. So I really try to also talk with leadership in churches when we're trying to work with pastors. Talk to the deacons, talk to their board, talk to men in the church who are other leaders who can give them support on some of this. Because I do think, especially when you're dealing with denominations that tend to be a bit more fundamentalist, it's very difficult to come out and preach otherwise from what they've been indoctrinated with for many, many decades. So I think it's hard, but I think we can get there. We do. I have a counterpart at Equal Justice who is the manager of our evangelical network, and she's had tremendous success meeting with pastors and denominations and moving them on these issues. But it is a slow process. I think that when talking to, evangelical leaders, I think one of the stronger things to talk about is the racial bias in the system. I think that's something that, especially groups like Southern Baptist and others in the Deep South, are becoming more and more aware of and concerned with and starting to talk about more. And I think that that's a really excellent place to show them that this has been a real crime against people of color in our country for centuries and continues to be. And this is something that we should be concerned with. And again, give people those baby steps to move on, and don't ask them to change overnight, but give them these sort of strongholds. And I've seen some great movement. I think Dr. Russell Moore, who's in Nashville, I think his comments on the death penalty have been really interesting, and where I would hope to see somebody progressing on this issue in his kind of position, talking about the racial bias, talking about the innocence issues. I don't think that we need to ask pastors to change their biblical stance on the death penalty. I think we need them to admit that the way our system functions is a gross injustice, cannot be co-signed by anybody who values life and liberty, and that ultimately we are not living in the same society as the people in Israel were when they were giving those commands.
Yeah. Um, Here's another one, and you've answered this a little bit, but for those, what's the best way to frame our argument for those who are pro-life and pro-death penalty?
Yeah, I think for people who are pro-life, the pushback I often get if they're not also anti-death penalty is that they only believe in protecting innocent life, which I think is a really weird, like, cop out, frankly. Ultimately, if you're pro-life, then you believe human life has value at all phases. And if you're pro-life, I would think you would believe that that human life has value that can't be won or lost, that it is innate. As a Christian, I believe that that is innate because we are all made in the image of God. So I think that's a breakdown in their own ideology that they need to grapple with. But again, it can be really hard to tell somebody that and expect them to do it and not become offended with that kind of bluntness. And so I think really the best way to help them progress is to really show them that we are talking about innocent life in the system. You can't use that excuse when it comes to the death penalty because we kill innocent people every year. So even if you're only for protecting innocent people and you just don't care about anybody else but innocent people, we do kill innocent people. And then I'd ask them to dig a little bit deeper into what is an innocent person, because again, none of us are innocent. We've all done things that are wrong. We've all harmed other people. And at what point does somebody lose their value, right? I don't think that they do. And I don't think you can say that they do if you do have a consistent view on the world. But I think just starting with the innocence numbers is the best place, and then help them question that and tease that out a bit more.
So here's another one. Well, hasn't this always been part of our country?
Almost. There was a brief time period in the 70s where it was not. But yeah, I think that that's true, and that's problematic. If you really look at the origins of the death penalty, they do stem from lynching in this country, which is how we carried this out for many years. There have always been these racial components to this kind of to the use of executions. They were done in the public square. We actually saw a huge abolitionist effort rise up in this country in the late 1800s. Because of that, because when people were having to witness this and see it up close, they were like, oh, wait, we don't want to be doing this. And so then you saw them start to move executions indoors. And then again, you had another period where the country sort of started to push back and say, wait, we don't want to be doing this. This is wrong. There's racial bias in it. This is inhumane. And so you again saw the country take a pause in the 70s. And then they brought it back, and they keep trying to do these things to basically whitewash it and to humanize it and to try to make it look more sterile and to try to remove it from the public's eye. Even nowadays, journalists have to fight like hell to try to witness these things. They are constantly being blocked from even viewing it. There's curtains up. It's just this really dark, opaque system that operates without transparency, without accountability. And they ultimately know that the more you get this in front of people, the less they'll want to do it. Because I think it's really easy to be like, yeah, that person deserves to die. But then when you're asked to participate in it, there is something awful about taking human life. It is scarring to people. We offer public paid therapy for jury members who are asked to sentence people to death because it really wrecks them. We have tons of people we work with who have worked in corrections, who've worked in execution chambers, even who are scarred for life over this. When you really ask people to get up close and personal to killing somebody, it sets in, and it's something that really weighs on people and traumatizes them and creates even more harm. This isn't something we should take lightly. And again, I think the fact that we have people who will try to take it lightly and say, I do it, I would be the first to do it. Well, no, you wouldn't. But I think you've been really conditioned in a society that doesn't value life to think that it would be that easy to take it.
Yeah. So I get this one a lot of why are we trying to end this? Why don't we just fix the problems and keep doing it?
Yeah, I get that one all the time, especially from people close to me. And again, I think it's kind of funny. I'm like, when have you ever seen government fix itself? Please name me the program that government came in and fixed itself on. I'd love to see it. Maybe I'd change my whole view on government if you could show me even one instance where government did that. I'd love to see it. I'd love it. And it's always the limited government people who are making this argument of like, let's just fix it. Let's just come on. I think that's another cop out. I think they know that you can't fix it. I think that's just their way of trying to step around it. As a whole though, fix which part? We're going to fix the innocence issues. How? Because there are so many people that contribute to them. There's so many things that we do that contribute to them. Like even, eyewitness testimony has been involved in 70% of wrongful convictions. So are we going to ban eyewitness testimony? Are you going to ban DNA evidence? What are you going to do? We cannot ever get to a point where we can be 100% sure that we're getting it right because we're fallible. Our systems are fallible. Our evidence is fallible. It's just not actually possible. There's no way you could ever create a system where you 100% of the time did not kill innocent people. It's just not possible. On top of that, how are you going to fix things like racial bias? Oftentimes that's a thing that people are not aware of, right? It's something that's in their subconscious bias. We see that jury members tend to convict people more harshly who have darker skin tones. Even among black men with darker skin tones get harsher sentences than those with lighter skin tones. That's something that's happening in subconscious biases. And we can try to make people more aware of that. We can try to train them. We can try to give more education to jurors beforehand, but it'll still happen. The arbitrariness in it, we can't necessarily fix that. That's again something that comes down to personal decisions that are being made by different local officials. How are we going to fix the cost of it? We can't. The reason the costs are so expensive are because we put in all these metrics that were supposed to ensure that we didn't get innocent people on death row anymore, and they still fail. But if we're going to try to make sure we don't kill innocent people, we need them and more. So you're going to make it even more expensive, right? It's not actually something they've thought through. It's a deflection. And so I think you should make them answer it. Keep probing. Be like, all right, how would we fix it? Let's dig into this because you can't, and there's no way to do it. And if you know the first thing about government, you would know that.
Yeah. So last question, because we're hoping to wrap up here in the next 5 minutes. At the end of the day, when we're talking about any of these cases, at the center of it is a victim who has been murdered, if not multiple victims, and their family members who are mourning and who are grieving. And so, how do we get justice for those people?
Yeah, the victim family member issue is one that I think actually should be talked about even more than it is, because there's always this assumption of people. And I know this was one reason I used to support the death penalty. I felt very confident that were I in that situation, I would want it for myself and for my family. And I just assumed everybody else would feel the same way. And I did what many people do, which was speak for victims and their families that I'd never met. And that's wrong. That's something that I've had to parse out and realize, like, we should never do that. We're trying to speak for people who've been through a terrible thing. We need to listen versus speak. And when you start doing that, you will find that a vast percentage of these people who have experienced these tragedies are against the death penalty. Now, I'm not saying that all of them are. There are certainly some who are in favor. But when we have worked around state legislatures that are moving repeal bills, we've seen victims' family members turn out in favor of getting rid of it versus those who turn out in favor of keeping it. Something like 40-1. It is a vast number that show up wanting to get rid of it. Our sponsor in New Hampshire was somebody who was a two-time murder victim's family member. I think that there are such overwhelming numbers of victims' family members who don't want it because they know something we don't. They know that this is something that actually prevents closure. It's something that prolongs their grief and suffering. It's something that continues to make them like live with this open wound of like going back into court and hearing these details and like continuing to wait for this like finality that might never come. And that even when it does come, many say leaves them with this open, like wound feeling of being lied to, like they were promised that this would give them closure and this would help them by police and prosecutors. And ultimately it doesn't. Many of them never have their wishes respected from the very beginning. Prosecutors don't listen to them when they say they don't want the death penalty. And then on top of everything else, it's something that wastes a tremendous amount of money that oftentimes those people need. They might need therapy services. They might need help relocating if they're somewhere that's unsafe. They might need financial assistance with like childcare if they've just lost a provider or a spouse. Like there's things that money could actually be going to victim services that would help them. Many of them describe not being able to like get off work or afford to travel to be at the hearings for these kinds of cases. Like it's just really sad what actually happens to these people and the mud that they get drugged throughout the system. And then we also have a lot of victims family members who, again, their loved ones' murders were never solved. They got no justice. They got no closure whatsoever because the system wastes so much money on the death penalty for a few cherry-picked cases. And they recognize that that's wrong. And they recognize that their loved one was rated as a lower priority victim and didn't get near the resources or attention that some of these death penalty cases did. And so I think it's really important to listen to them and to their experiences. What I found at state capitals that is so frustrating is that the lawmakers who are most in favor of keeping the death penalty, who usually come out and say it's for victims and their family members, will not meet with these people. They won't sit down with them. If they give testimony, they'll often leave the room. They don't want to be confronted with the fact that everything they've hung their beliefs on is wrong when it comes to this. And it's a very frustrating thing. I even saw Trump and his administration, when they resumed federal execution, say this is for the victims. And literally their victims' family members were on camera in videos appealing to the administration saying, we don't want this, please don't do this. And yet they would come out and in a publicity stunt to the public say this is for the victims and their family members. It's just this a horrible violation and like secondary trauma that these families go through when politicians use them in this way and overspeak and basically twist the narrative.
Yeah. Well, Hannah, thanks so much for joining us this morning. I always think that you have such great responses and always enjoy talking to you about this. So thanks so much.
Likewise.
If you are participating in the rest of Justice Day, go to the link that you were provided for the training at 8:45 and we'll see you there. Thanks again, Hannah.
Thanks.